We are Republica. Thank you. Welcome back. So we're going to be hearing from Gabriella Coleman. She'll be talking about geek politics and anonymous. She's an anthropologist looking at law, digital media, and its role in political activism. And she's here to tell you more.
Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for coming out this morning. I'm excited to give this talk today here in Germany. It's really interesting. This morning at my hotel, the person who checked me in said, I've seen you before. I've read your pieces in the Atlantic about Anonymous. And I was thinking, wow, that would just never happen in the United States. Germany is really quite unique when it comes to technology. So I'm excited to be here. So, as mentioned, I'm a professor of media studies at New York University. I'm an anthropologist who's done a lot of work on free software and anonymous. So I'm just going to jump in the hopes that we'll have some time for Q&A. Okay, so over the last 3 years, Anonymous has undergone a series of transformations. It was initially called into being primarily to troll and to prank. And then it became a narrowly focused protest movement against the Church of Scientology in 2008. In September of 2010, there was a new arm of Anonymous, a new operation called Operation Payback that emerged. And this arm of Anonymous turned its attention to WikiLeaks in December of 2010, receiving massive media attention. And it received this attention because of the denial of service attacks, the DDoS, that they were launching against PayPal and MasterCard. And it was really interesting because despite the kind of massive media coverage that was happening, and despite the fact that they had already protested against the Church of Scientology, commentators really struggled quite a bit to describe their ethics, their actions, their participants in kind of traditional categories. And this difficulty in describing Anonymous follows from the fact that Anonymous is shrouded in some degree of mystery, some level but not total of anonymity. It purports to have no leaders, no hierarchy, nor any geographical epicenter. And what is true about Anonymous is that it is a name that, in theory, anyone can take as their own. So, for example, people launching the denial of service attacks may not be the same people who write manifestos. And the people kind of organizing the protests against the Church of Scientology are not quite the same people engaging in Operation Payback. So there are a lot of kind of mysteries and misconceptions to Anonymous. And my purpose today is to clarify some of these misconceptions, as well as give you a sense of what is important about their politics. So the talk is divided into 3 parts. The first part, which is the longest, is the history. I've given a little bit of an introduction just in case some people don't know what Anonymous is, but I'll go much deeper. Then there's a section, also a bit meaty, about power and authority and norms within Anonymous. And then I'm going to conclude briefly with some thoughts about the limits and strengths to their politics and what we should be asking of Anonymous. All right, so I'm going to dive in. So the roots of Anonymous lie in a very popular image board, 4chan, which I bet a lot of people here have been to. And 4chan is a place where people discuss all sorts of things anonymously, but it's also a place where there's a heck of a lot of trolls and trolling. It's certainly not the only place where trolling happens, but it is one place. And trolling on Anonymous, or on 4chan, takes a unique form, which is crowdsourced distributed trolling and hacking. So some trolling is not anonymous. There's individuals. And on 4chan and other places, people kind of contribute in small bits to troll. Trolling on Anonymous takes various forms, but sometimes when a target is chosen, Lots of unpaid pizzas are ordered to the target's home. If there's servers of an organization that they're targeting, they're DDoS. And of course, the most important part is splattering very humiliating personal information all over the internet. And since 2006, possibly earlier, Anonymous has been trolling under the name. Now, why troll? Well, if you talk to trolls, they will say that the motivating force and the emotional consequences for the lulz. The lulz is a bastardization and pluralization of laugh out loud. And trolling in the lulz is on a kind of spectrum, right? So some trolling is a little bit creepy. And as someone who works on trolls and trolling, I'm often, or have been, the target of light trolling. Someone once left a comment about the lulz and trolling on a podcast interview that I did that I think captures well the kind of sentiment and emotional tenor of the lulz. Someone by the name of Lobster wrote, "As for Miss Coleman, I appreciate the work she's doing, but I would not want to be locked in a room with her. She has gazed deeply into the abyss. Who knows what horrors have taken root in her mind and lies sleeping, waiting to unleash unfathomable nightmares for the lulz." So that's kind of the creepy side of the lulz, but you know, the lulz is on a spectrum. It could also refer to kind of jokes and cute images and cute and furry cats, right? So on 4chan, lots of trolling occurs, and in 2008, a legendary wave of trolling was unleashed against the Church of Scientology by Anonymous. And Anonymous kind of decided to troll the Church of Scientology after a video of Tom Cruise was released. And there was a video that was internal to the church. It wasn't meant for public consumption. Someone leaked it. And then Scientology was going to sue online publishers such as Gawker because they weren't taking it down. So let's take a quick look at the video. I'll show about 20 seconds.
But if that's what Mr. Cruise has brought to this world, there still remains one more word on the man. Call it Tom Cruise on Tom Cruise Scientologist.
I think it's a privilege to call yourself a Scientologist, and it's something that you have to earn. And because a Scientologist does, he or she has the ability to create new and better realities and improve conditions. Being a Scientologist, you look at someone and you know absolutely that you can help them.
So what's interesting about this video, too, is if anyone has seen other kind of video productions by Scientology, they kind of suck. I don't know why this one is kind of high production, even though it's kind of ridiculous. But this video went viral, right? And so Anonymous, after hearing that Scientology was going to go after online publishers in the United States under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, they engaged in a series of raids, which included pizza ordering, faxing, DDoSing, lots of prank calls, and being kind of as offensive as possible. I invited some participants of Anonymous to my class, and they gave a little lecture. It was actually quite good. And one of them described the raids quite accurately and offensively as ultra-coordinated motherfuckery. So consistent with previous actions, Anonymous was just trolling for the sake of the lulz. But soon after the first wave of trolling, some participants organized a worldwide day of protests that eventually became a more traditional protest movement. What happened? What was this change of heart about? Why did Anonymous veer towards more political territory? Well, it's really kind of fascinating because it was really 3 user-generated videos that were the actors that catalyzed the debate that kind of led Anonymous somewhat accidentally and chaotically into the realm of political protest. So the first video and also the most famous, declared war against the Church of Scientology. And I'm going to show not the full thing, but a short clip of it.
Hello, leaders of Scientology. We are anonymous. Over the years, we have been watching you, your campaigns of misinformation, your suppression of dissent, your litigious nature. All of these things have caught our eye. With the leakage of your latest propaganda video into mainstream circulation, the extent of your malign influence over those who have come to trust you as leaders has been made clear to us. Anonymous has therefore decided that your organization should be destroyed, for the good of your followers, for the good of mankind, and for our own enjoyment.
I like to end with "for our own enjoyment," because apparently this video was made for the lulz. It was just really made for the lulz. But two things happened afterwards. A critic of the church by the name of Mark Bunker, eventually redubbed Wise Beard Man, he made a video and he's like, look, you Anonymous, I see some potential here, but you guys are just too over the top, way out of control. Can you please rein in the trolling? Can you be less offensive? Can you actually engage in some legal political action? And people kind of took his video seriously. And then there was another video. It was a kind of more sincere call to action made by Anonymous. And enough people decided to move forward to organize a day of protest. They left the internet. And on February 10th, 2008, over 6,000 people protested across North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. Supposedly one person showed up in Japan. And they were really impressive, actually. Here's a few pictures from the protests. And I went to the ones in New York, and what was really interesting to me was that a good chunk of the protesters lacked what you normally associate with street protests, which is political consciousness, intentionality, and of course people knew about Scientology because it's kind of part of pop culture, but they really didn't know all that much about it. And in fact, the atmosphere was carnivalesque, and people were talking in super hypercharged internet jargon about lolcats. They were talking about long cats. There was a lot of kind of images of long cats, mudkips, you know, the sorts of things that came out of the world of 4chan. So soon after this first day of protests, a separation of people occurred. A group of people returned back to the internet from whence they came, and a group of people decided to continue on to protest the Church of Scientology, and they still do. One Irish protester who I met in August condensed the collective mood by saying, I came for the lulz, but I stayed for the outrage. And that sentiment was voiced by many over and over again on forums, on internet relay chat, and so on and so forth. Now, the lulz, you know, he came for the lulz, he stayed for the outrage, but the lulz still had a role to play in this branch of Anonymous and other branches. And I'm going to bracket that for now and return to it, because it didn't simply evaporate. And what's interesting about Anonymous is that they have to juggle between kind of more traditional political protests and the lulz, which is far more grotesque and inflammatory and humorous and offensive. And juggling between the two is not always easy. Okay, so starting in September of 2008 till about 2010, the name of Anonymous was used in various capacities. It was used still to troll, and it was used to protest the Church of Scientology, although there was a few small operations that were also political, such as one in Iran that happened in 2009, or in support of Iran. In September of 2010, there was a new kind of operation. People called the name of Anonymous, again on 4chan, to call into being Operation Payback. And Anonymous DDoSed the Motion Picture Association of America and eventually other organizations, and they did so because the MPAA had hired an Indian software firm to DDoS the Pirate Bay. And in retaliation and in support of the Pirate Bay, Anonymous kind of showed its face. And what's really interesting about this is that it gives us a window into something that I think is common, not super common, but there are instances of digital privateering. So privateers were hired by European nations to fight in their wars. This was outlawed in the mid-1800s when they had their own navies. And what we see now is a lot of governments and corporations hire programmers to do their dirty work. What's really important to emphasize is that this operation came out of 4chan, like previous ones, but 4chan being anonymous and being that there is no archive is not a great place to coordinate protests, so they moved onto internet relay chat. But it's really important to emphasize that this arm or manifestation of Anonymous was not the same as those protesting the Church of Scientology. Some people crossed over, but really these were now two separate phenomena, two different networks. Okay, December 2010, everyone's talking about WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks releases a small trove of diplomatic cables. And then Operation Payback shifted its attention to WikiLeaks. And they did so not just to support WikiLeaks, right? They did so at a very particular moment. They did it once PayPal, MasterCard, and Amazon is like, we're not going to serve you anymore. And they kind of bowed to sort of almost unstated political pressure. WikiLeaks had not been found guilty of anything, much less charged. So Anonymous really went ballistic at this point. This is a manifesto against MasterCard. And what was really interesting about these DDoS attacks was their sheer size. They were really exceptional in a number of ways. First, they managed to get over 7,000 participants on one internet relay chat channel, which I've been told this is one of the largest numbers of participants, human participants at least, not bots, on an IRC channel. If you know otherwise, please let me know. And what's also interesting is that despite the fact that it was quite chaotic, I'd really never seen anything like it. The number of people joining, talking, debating was really astounding. It was truly like a tidal wave. So despite the fact that it was kind of so chaotic, they did manage, however, to kind of control the DDoSing with a notable degree of deliberation and care. They would remind people to stay on target. As Anonymous is famous for, they would write collaboratively on Pirate Pad to talk about what targets to attack, who not to attack, and the kind of reasoning behind them. So here is a attack plan. And you see something like, do not attack the press ever. So these attacks eventually died down a little bit. And then Anonymous got involved in a kind of unlikely place. And the unlikely place was Tunisia. And they got involved in Tunisia even before the kind of mainstream Western media. Al Jazeera is a different story, but the Western media was even reporting with any kind of depth or accuracy as to what was going on in Tunisia. And so they started Op Tunisia on January 2nd, 2011, once WikiLeaks was blocked from the country. And then they continued to lend a helping hand as street protests just completely enveloped the country. In keeping with the tradition, they DDoSed the government websites, they DDoSed tourist websites, but they also started to engage in different strategies. They created a care packet, quite detailed, about how people could protect themselves from government surveillance, about where to find good encryption software. And in one of the packets that I read, someone left a little note detailing kind of the very limits of their own cyber activism. This Anon wrote, "This is your revolution. It will neither be Twittered nor televised or IRC'd. You must hit the streets. You will lose the fight. Always stay safe. Once you get arrested, you cannot do anything for yourself or your people. Your government is watching you." So Op Tunisia was really quite interesting in a number of ways because it represents some sort of shift within at least one political arm of Anonymous. Again, trolling still continued under this name. The protests against the Church of Scientology, which has a kind of human rights dimension, but it's still pretty narrow, was ongoing. But this really kind of enlarged the scope of what Anonymous was focusing in on, and also kind of converged or helped out with an existing political movement. Now, during this same period, in January, there was other important developments. In the United States, the FBI raided 40 alleged participants, issuing 40 subpoenas. Computers were seized. In the UK, 5, again, alleged participants were arrested, released, and I believe actually there's going to be some sort of trial coming up this week. So this was quite significant, but what's interesting was that these arrests and subpoenas did not kind of stop Anonymous. They were not deterred. In fact, they kind of continued to engage in many different operations. So as Tunisia helped to spark the kind of astounding protests in Egypt, Anonymous also turned their attention there. Since that time, they've gotten involved in numerous places, New Zealand, Italy, Wisconsin in the United States over the law that seeks to ban a union's right to kind of collectively bargain, and so on and so forth. Just last week, they engaged in Operation Sony in response to Sony's lawsuit against a hacker who had kind of cracked DRM and the PlayStation 3. So that's just a little bit of a kind of historical arc about what Anonymous is about in terms of the different political arms. And as I wrap this section up, I'd like to turn to the question of the transformation from the lulls, which I talked about, into human rights activism. And the story I told just now perhaps could be condensed into 9 words in a quote by William Shakespeare, who wrote, "Some rise by sin, and some by virtue fall." There's a way in which Anonymous arose from the heart of what a recent edited collection is called the offensive internet, which refers to blasphemy, defamation, trolling, and really it arose from one of the epicenters of the offensive internet, 4chan. And it has undergone changes as it's become rhizomatic, as it has replicated to have these different arms and nodes. It's protested the Church of Scientology. It's engaged in offline political fights. Its contributions to what will be remembered as one of the kind of really astounding protests of the 21st century. Egypt really had an impact on the kind of consciousness of many Anons. This was what was written on IRC on the Operation Egypt channel when Mubarak fell. And also there's a way in which perhaps some Anons will fall, going back to the quote of Shakespeare, given that some have been arrested, right? Some rise by sin and some by virtue fall. Well, although the Shakespeare quote would be a really nice way to kind of tie a ribbon around this historical box that I just provided, it actually would not be very accurate. If it was used, it would leave you with the false impression that the lulls, which I don't like to talk about the lulls as sin, but it kind of points to some sort of its spirit. It would give you the impression that the lulls no longer matters within Anonymous among those that kind of have engaged with human rights activism. And that's actually not quite the case. The lulls still matters, although it's contained, it's been transformed, but it still shows up, in part because this is the culture from which they arose, and how can you be anonymous if you don't have that element anymore? So I'm going to just give you one last story about how the lulls emerged in the context of all this kind of more human rights-oriented activism. So there was an act of trolling that happened soon or during the kind of Egyptian protests, and it happened when Aaron Barr, who's a security researcher, went to the Financial Times And he said, hey, I've been infiltrating Anonymous, and I'm going to reveal the name of some of the kind of core participants. He worked for the firm HB Gary, a security firm. Well, a swift and brutal response was orchestrated by a small group of hackers within Anonymous. His Twitter account was completely hacked, and like the most offensive 140-character statements were spewed from his account. They hacked into HB Gary. They deleted a bunch of backups. They downloaded his email. And then they proceeded to put his email online. They, of course, as many trolls do, splattered images of Aaron Barr kind of all over the internet as well to embarrass him. Okay. And they did this in approximately 48 hours as well. Well, when this happened, the mood of Anonymous was electric and electrified. And for all sorts of reasons. First was the sweet irony that a so-called security researcher who was going to unveil, and take off the mask of Anonymous could actually be so easily hacked, right? Second, many people within Anonymous had been expressing concern that the lulls had been depleted during the Middle Eastern protests. The gas tank of the lulls was running on low, and they felt that this had kind of filled it up back to full. Finally, as an extra bonus, it looked like this trolling retaliation actually led to some good in the world. As it turned out, HB Gary was engaging, or wanted to engage, in the forms of digital privateering that I had raised earlier. Among other things, they had a PowerPoint presentation where they suggested that they could discredit WikiLeaks by handing over false information that, when revealed as a forgery, would then discredit the organization of WikiLeaks. They also wanted to discredit reporters, most famously Glenn Greenwald, who writes for Salon.com, and they felt like discrediting him would also hurt WikiLeaks. They wrote, again, this was in PowerPoint in specific, these are established professionals that ultimately, most of them, if pushed, will choose professional preservation over cause. Without the support of people like Glenn, WikiLeaks would fold. And so Anonymous's actions revealed the inner workings of an outsourced and privatized agent provocateur proposal, which was never it never panned out, but it certainly revealed the extent to which private organizations were willing to work for governments to engage in this sort of action. Now, when this had happened, I asked Anonymous, how can you reconcile the more kind of traditional activism with these acts of rogue trollishness? And I got a number of answers, which are interesting, so I'll relay them. One of them was, the people who engaged in these acts of hacking and trolling were really a small group of people. And you can't characterize all of Anon through one action, because at one time there's 10 or 15 things going on at the same time. And, for better or for worse, that is to some degree true. And then the second kind of answer was that Aaron Barr was putting the lives of people in danger. People were maybe going to go to jail, and there was no kind of legal mechanism by which to address it quickly. So they decided to take an exceptional path due to exceptional circumstances. So I'm not going to kind of moralize it right now. We can maybe talk about it in the Q&A. The point is really that the lulls and trolling is still part of the kind of tactical repertoire used by Anonymous within the political arms, and yet is also more contained and predictable than in places like 4chan. All right, so now I'm going to move to the next section, which is about authority, power, and norms within Anonymous. How is it organized? Where does power lie? Who participates in Anonymous? How can we conceptualize the relationship between the different facets of Anonymous? Well, technically, Anonymous erects no formal barriers. It's different from free software projects, for example, where you really have to show your chops before you can become part of the project. And so, anyone, as they say, can join. But obviously, not everyone just joins Anonymous, right? It really is more attractive to people who basically spend a heck of a lot of time online. And so there's forms of kind of explicit knowledge, tacit knowledge, ethical sympathies that make anonymous attractive to some people and not others. A small kind of group of anonymous are computer hackers, which I know can mean many different things. A computer hacker is not just X, but can mean, you know, a hardware hacker, free software hacker, info security, more transgressive hacking. But basically, they're kind of programmers, system administrators, security researchers who identify as such. And there's definitely people in anonymous like that. I would say a much larger group are, for lack of a better word, geeks. They have some form of kind of digital literacy. They spend a lot of time online. They maybe know how to configure a blog. They've got video editing skills, design skills, and so on and so forth. And then there's people who would not identify as others, as either geeks or hackers. Within the arm that protests the Church of Scientology, there's actually a small but kind of fiercely dedicated group of ex-Scientologists. And I've talked to them. They're like, yeah, I've had to learn a heck of a lot about like this kind of geeky bunker of internet culture to even understand what the heck is going on, right? So it's kind of bounded to some degree. Now, to understand anonymous and really to understand so many domains of hacker geek production, of course, internet relay chat is the technical medium through which people form social bonds, through which they collaborate, and it's no different within anonymous. What I just want to point out, and I've just seen this repeated so many times, people are like, represent these as kind of hard to find secret bunkers. Well, in fact, you know, one network even advertises on their main website or provides a link for how to join. They're not in any way closed off. It's just most of the public doesn't know how to use IRC. There's two main networks, AnonNet, which is focused on the protest against the Church of Scientology, and then AnonOps, which is the one that kind of is organizing the protests in support of WikiLeaks, the Middle East protests, and so on and so forth. Obviously, on IRC, what is called an IRC op, an operator, which is not unique to Anonymous, they're on all networks, has more power insofar as they can ban people from the network, and you can get banned for technical reasons or for violating norms. So if you connect and disconnect often, they'll ban you. In the case of AnonOps, they'll ban you if you promote violence. And then they'll ban you because there's also internal drama within the organization as well, as kind of all groups have. However, to be an op, you don't have to be technically skilled. There's a number of them who I would not consider kind of hackers who've become ops, and there's dozens of them. And they certainly carry more authority during debates, but they don't necessarily call the shots within Anonymous. Authority also comes in the form of ethical sensibilities and norms and policy. And here we can see how there's connections between both networks. So participants in both networks are overwhelmingly committed to information freedom. They're against censorship. And as their name suggests, anonymous, they believe that anonymity is a mechanism by which to secure vibrant political speech. That idea is not their innovation. This is a kind of long-standing principle in many liberal democracies, even though there's a debate as to how much anonymity one should be provided to secure democracy. As I mentioned, in AnonOps, there is an explicit policy not to attack the media, do not attack the media, even forms of media that are seen to be a corrupt arm of state power, as in Iran. But what I think is the most interesting norm, and this is true across both networks, you have to look at their anti-leader, anti-celebrity ethic. And what it does is that it modulates or lessens the concentration of power, although it may not fully eliminate it. But it certainly has a role to play, and a very important one. And what's really interesting about Anonymous is that this ethic is played out through words as well as through deeds, through action. There's kind of a constant reminder, do not act like a leader, do not act like a leader, do not seek attention for yourself, do not say who you are. And there's huge conversations about it. But there's also these moments of clarification where a participant might be banned from a network because he or she has called too much attention to herself. I was recently witness to this kind of very act when a participant had been too public about himself to a reporter, and an article was written in a national newspaper in the United States where this guy kind of revealed his name and his age, and people were just kind of aghast at this, especially because this person had not even participated in the DDoS attacks. He hadn't even put his life at risk. And so when this kid, I think he was not that old, got online, he was completely chastised, and people were like, why did you do this? What, you know we're not supposed to do this. And then someone who carries some authority said this, which kind of condensed the collective mood. He said, attempting to use all the work that so many have done for your personal promotion is not something I will tolerate. And he was an operator and banned him. And so it's really interesting because it was a reminder for everyone who was watching, my jaw was dropping, whoa, that you cannot act in a certain way, that to secure your right to participate in Anonymous, you really have to embody this anti-leader, anti-celebrity ethic, which is so interesting because nearly everything on the internet, with the exception of anonymous image boards, with the exception of Anonymous, is about me, attention, celebrity, and so on and so forth. So it really runs against the current of a kind of cultural commitment that is so prevalent on the internet. Now, I just want to kind of re-emphasize that within Anonymous, there's certainly those that have more authority. It's those especially who put more work and time. Like many domains of geek and hacker action, it is a do-ocracy. And this ethic kind of helps to modulate the pooling of power, even if it doesn't fully or always succeed. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it does not. And while the kind of anti-celebrity, anti-leader ethic is a bit unique to Anonymous, a lot of different domains like free software also worry about the pooling of power, and they have mechanisms by which to disperse it. And I just mention it because there was an article in Gawker, which is an online website. I guess all websites are online, but it's a website, an online publisher, who claimed to have found the leaders, hacker versus hackers, in Anonymous. They were in the secret war room. And they actually did find the hackers who were involved in the HB Gary hack. And hacking is powerful. The ability to kind of hack in and delete servers, is not something to be taken lightly. But the article kind of confused the power to hack with the power to lead the entire network. And these things can't be collapsed in Anonymous. Okay, now I'm going to move towards a conclusion and talk just a little bit about the kind of politics of Anonymous, how they're configured, what we should think about them ethically, what are some of the strengths, and what are kind of the limits. Okay, so I kind of contextualize Anonymous today by focusing in on the political arms. There's still people who use the name to troll. And it came out of the offensive internet, the lulls, and it kind of didn't leave it fully behind, but didn't fully bring it with them as they kind of started to engage in politics. A lot of the politics of Anonymous, especially the more recent manifestation, is tactical, and it's full of spectacle. They're really, really quite good at spectacle. And some theorists, I'm thinking of someone like Stephen Duncombe, who has written a wonderful book on spectacle called Dream. He argues, spectacle can be quite effective for garnering media attention and also making visible a set of issues that may not be so visible. And Anonymous is good at that. But spectacle has its limits. Basically, if you overuse it, people won't pay attention to it anymore. There's a kind of fatigue built into it. And I think there's a way in which this current arm of Anonymous, in using DDoS quite a bit, has also deflated the power of spectacle to some degree. I think it's also important to interrogate the use of DDoS. as a political weapon, that is which brings into being some form of spectacle, there's a lot of questions to be asked, and it catalyzed a huge debate. Is it a form of direct action? Is it legitimate protest? Is it a form of civil disobedience? A lot of internet enthusiasts and hackers really differed in their views. So, for example, Richard Stallman, first of all, reminded the world that it wasn't hacking to DDoS, because you're not hacking into anything, you're just overwhelming a server with requests. But he did favorably, he portrayed them favorably as a mass demo against control. I was actually kind of surprised, but he wrote this editorial for The Guardian. Famous hacker to this part of the world at the CCC Congress describes DDoSing as juvenile, infantile, and kind of suggested to Anonymous to come talk to him so that, you know, they can mature and engage in more constructive action. And I'm personally not going to come down on a position. I do think it has a role to play. But if we're going to assess it, there's two things we should do, one of which is contextualize it within the broader milieu of DDoSing, and I'll talk about that in a second, and also talk about predecessors, other people, other groups who have used this technique. And so two different political organizations who have used DDoS in the past have been the Anonymous Digital Coalition and the Electronic Disturbance Theater. And like Anonymous, they all conceptualize what they do as conscientious action. They see it as law-breaking that is legitimate insofar as they're making a kind of statement through this action. Now, the big difference is that Anonymous Digital Coalition as well as Electronic Disturbance Theater were quite small, and while you can kind of participate in them, they weren't configured in such a way to get 7,000 people to participate at once. And once you have that amount of people, you both have power, right, to be able to kind of take down something like MasterCard, but you also have a lot of unpredictability and a lot of risk. You can't control those 7,000 people. And civil disobedience traditionally has been tightly controlled. It's not participatory. So does the participatory element of Anonymous actually go against the grain of thinking about DDoS as civil disobedience? The second element to consider, of course, is that DDoS has been used far more by the powerful to silence the weak than the other way around. So there was an important Berkman Center for the Study of Internet and Society report which showed just how extensive governments deploy DDoS to silence small human rights organizations, right? And so by using DDoS, do we then just proliferate a tactic, right? Or alternatively, if we make it uber illegal, and it is pretty illegal already in certain countries like the United States and UK, then do we just leave DDoS to those who can evade the law and with the power and resources to do it, such as corporations and governments? So these are kind of certain questions that I think are really important to address as we assess this tactic as civil disobedience. But it's important to remember that Anonymous has shown already that it's not only bound to kind of tactical forms of politics that engage in spectacle, but they've also engaged in more strategic, long-term organization. The protests against the Church of Scientology are ongoing. They happen every month in many cities across Europe, the United States, and I truly do think that they had an important role to play in allowing critics of the church to be far more visible and less anonymous, ironically. And I would include myself insofar as I used to work, or I still do, on geek and hacker protests against the Church of Scientology, but I was never very public about it because I didn't want to get embroiled in a lawsuit and post anonymous. I was like, well, they've got their hands tied. Let me just be far more public. So they've had a really important role. The arm of Anonymous that is engaged in the Middle East protests has also turned to more strategic action by creating technology to evade censorship and kind of becoming a little bit more organized, not in the hierarchical sense, but getting to know each other and learning what they can and cannot do. So they move between the tactical and the strategic. So just to wrap up, even the different political arms of Anonymous use different tactics. But I think there's a few things we can say more generally about them. Since the winter of 2008, due to providing non-traditional mechanisms of actions, and ones that really made use of the full capabilities of what the internet has to offer, it has acted as a political gateway for many geeks and people who care about internet issues to take action. For some, they contribute to Anonymous by writing manifestos. They just love to write manifestos. There's a lot of designers who make the artwork. There's a lot of kind of what they call propaganda as well, which is really astounding in the form of videos and art. It provides flexible and discrete micro-protest possibilities that aren't otherwise there in a way that allows individuals to renounce their individuality, but also be part of something greater. You don't have to fill out a form. You don't have to send money in. You don't even have to give your name. But you're probably going to engage in a form of politics that also has a lot of lulls and a lot of laughs, for better or for worse. The decision to engage in political action has to happen through some sort of concrete path, some sort of set of events, and influence. And I think Anonymous has been important because it's definitely been that path for a large number of people. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, and I'll just take questions when people are ready.
Thank you, Gabriella. That was a fantastic talk.
Thanks.
If you have questions, please come to the front. We have time to take a few. I know you're just here for the lulz, but stay for some insights.
Should I go ahead? Hi, my name is Sarus Farvar. Thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned that there were some people from Anonymous who are being charged with crimes in the US and the UK. And I'm curious if those people who have been charged with hacking or DDoSing or whatever, if they are, did they get caught because they, didn't use proper encryption, or did they get caught because they actually have some kind of authority within? I know you talked about how there isn't an authority, but obviously there's some people that have a little bit more influence than others.
That's a good question. So in the United States, no one's been charged yet. It was subpoenas just to get information. In my sense, the FBI is definitely on IRC, right? And, whether you hang out with Anonymous or other troll groups, part of the fun of being online is when they're kind of making fun of the FBI. And so my sense is, the FBI knows who the infrastructural operators are, right? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to find that out. And what's really fascinating about that, in fact, is I know one operator, in fact, who doesn't even engage in any of the politics. He's like, I'm providing a platform, and I can't get in trouble for that, right? So the question is, can a provider of the platform be considered someone who is contributing? I do think that Anonymous, especially at the beginning, wasn't totally using full encryption to hide themselves. And definitely post these attacks, there's a little bit more of an awareness. Don't keep logs, maybe use encryption, and make it a personal choice. For some, they're like, well, we're being conscientious about this, and it's okay to be arrested, and for others, it's not. So a little bit of both.
Hi, Markus. I have a question. There is this concept of positive and negative freedom, where the positive freedom is that we ensure everybody to have his personal freedom and can do whatever he wants, and where the negative freedom is that we have, in the modern state, the laws which ensure the ecosystem where I can live free. So, but it may put down the personal freedom of others. And you mentioned that there's some kind of self-control within Anonymous if some people, but there is no constitutional law, no representative democracy. So what do you think are the impacts on this positive-negative freedom thing?
Yeah, that's a great question because and I've studied Debian, the free software project, quite a bit, and they have both constitutional, like law, as well as the more informal modes of operating freedom, right? And early on in Debian, they only had the informal modes of organizing freedom, and then it became quite formalized in pretty dramatic ways. And Anonymous is fascinating because they're kind of in its informal, charismatic stage where obviously they're too, sort of like Wikipedia, like Debian, they're just in a stage where they're not going to formalize. But the very, very, very ideology and purpose of Anonymous is such to prevent structure. Whereas with Debian, that was not the case. They may not love it, and a lot of geeks and hackers are against bureaucracy and red tape, and yet they've had to formalize a little bit. So with Anonymous, it'll be fascinating to see whether they formalize a little bit more, or their very kind of ideological commitment prevents that type of more explicit legal rulemaking that you're talking about.
Do you have one more question?
Great speech, thank you. When younger people are involved, often there is a generational change. So you have one group forming, next generation comes up, doesn't want to mix with the generation before, new group forms. How do you see Anonymous in the midterm and the long-term run?
Wait, can you repeat the last part?
How do you see Anonymous in the long term?
Yeah, that's a really good question because there is a way, you know, I try to signal this in my talk because on the one hand, Anonymous, you know, is open to all, and it uses some forms of language, free speech, that has kind of wide cultural currency, people can identify, and yet it comes out of this extremely kind of geeky, esoteric bunker of the internet, you know? I mean, I can talk in, you know, sentences that are just filled with jargon from, you know, Encyclopedia Dramatica, and you would think that I'm talking in Chinese, I'm talking in English, right? And that's kind of, to some degree, generational. And then the question is, how do you then ensure social reproduction over time? Again, I find comparing to free software very interesting because free software is, I consider, intergenerational. There's like the old Unix guys with big beards, and then the young people. And what joins them is the Unix architecture, which has been around since 1969, and it's a shared lingua franca, shared language by which to connect the generations. And I think with a formation like Anonymous, you have that a little bit less, right? And so that you may fall in the trap of it losing its power or force over time. But one thing that is pretty amazing about the world from which it emerged is that the cultural traditions of the lulz and trolling is actually like an oral culture, and they catalog everything. This is where Encyclopedia Dramatica is so important, because then through things like their lore, their history, their exploits, that may be one way to have links formed from the past, present, and future. But time will tell.
Hello. I've got a small footnote to your talk. First of all, the help package that you're referring to, as far as I know, has been provided by some well-known groups on the internet, like Telecomics and some French groups. So I think it was not quite to be attributed to Anonymous. And my question is, you were referring to celebrities inside Anonymous. Are you going to be banned?
Okay, so there's some anonymous developers that also participate in telecomics, and one of them has kind of conceptualized quite nicely telecomics and Anonymous as yin and yang. And what's interesting too about Anonymous is there's you know, really talented free software developers who are part of Anonymous. And my understanding is that they did take definitely some of the work from telecomics, but also did a lot of their own configuration and repackaging. And I actually think it's an important footnote because I think really taking a look at the relationship between various different nodes of kind of political intervention, such as telecomics and Anonymous, is necessary. Me, yeah. So there have been, I started working on Anonymous a long time ago through an odd set of reasons. And people ask me all the time, are you anonymous? Are you not anonymous? Well, as an anthropologist, the kind of ruling methodology is called participant observation, which is a bit of an oxymoron. But, you know, you get to know people really well, you help out where you can, but you don't fully get involved. So I don't engage in DDoSing, I don't wear my mask. And I think that they realize that I can't be anonymous. At the same time, there's a thread in one of the forums, Why We Protest, which is for the protest against the Church of Scientology, where someone's like, she's acting too much of a rock star in relationship to her work and Anonymous. And then people came into my defense, no, she does good work, she actually understands what we do, she's not just portraying us as basement dwellers who are, you know, bent on raising internet hell. But it's definitely something I think about, and if I had more time, I would also talk about the few people who are able to be visible within Anonymous, one of which does so without any problem. The other person does so with a lot of problems, but they tolerate it because he does so much work for the organization. No, it's not an organization, but for Anonymous. But I've definitely been in a pickle before, and I'm sure that will continue to be an issue as I move forward with research. I think that's it we have for time. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great, so we're just going to have a few minutes break before our next speaker. And I wanted to give a shout out to the talented Annalena, who's been visually recording the talks.
Yeah.
I think afterwards they're going to be online, so you can also come down and have a closer look and admire the wonderful art.